it's great to see all of you out there, and welcome to those that are tuning in live on Viking TV as well. A wonderful day in Tromsø today. If you had a chance to get out, I'm sure you did, but just great weather. It's amazing a difference it makes when you see the sunshine out there and the sunlight out there, isn't it? And it's great to hear that we're going to have another sunny day tomorrow as well. I'll make a confession right up front here. This was a difficult talk for me to put together. Partly because some of rural development, rural economic development in Norway, a big chunk of it is related to tourism. And I've got a talk coming up in about 3 days on tourism. I thought, well, I can't talk about tourism development because that'll take away from my talk a few days from now. And I can't talk about the Sami because that would overlap with what Penny's doing as well. So I had to scratch whatever hair I had left on my head to think of what to put together here. And I hope I'm going to give you something that you'll appreciate or learn a little bit from. And by the way, this image, if you recognize that place in the background, that's Tromsø in the background. So the reindeer herd on the other side of Tromsø. I don't think we saw those reindeer here anytime in the last little while. And the approach I decided to take for this, because I've got my roots are as a geographer, I decided to sort of do something as a geographer would, and that is to set the context. So at a broad level, and I've watched all the port talks, and I think I've seen most of the talks by the other speakers, and I realized that I don't think very many people have actually set that national context, what Norway is in relationship to other countries, its democracy, its economic development, those kinds of things. So I've got a little bit of that, and also almost even setting the geographic context of it as well. And then I'm going to look at sort of Norway's changing policies towards the Arctic and the relationship between Norway and how they approach development, because I think I've got a point later on here that says Norway's regional development is actually almost equivalent to rural development. And that's got a long history to it as to why they're so closely and attached to the rural context of the rural setting as opposed to an urban setting. And then what I thought I'd do is, after that broader context, I was going to look at 4 different places or issues, 3 places in fact, almost like case studies that are reflective of a different kind of rural development in Norway, and then one at the end that's more of an issue, and that issue leads to Norway's moral dilemma. And that's a bit of a teaser, because I'm going to ask you to think about what you think that moral dilemma is for the future of Norway. I'm not going to give it away just yet. So a bit of background, and I think you've seen a little bit of this, but I don't think you've heard it all. We're actually officially in the Kingdom of Norway, and it's a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary system. So it's a strange mixture where the king, in this case King Harald V, who's been in power in that role since 1991, is officially the head of state, but it's primarily a ceremonial role. He doesn't have a lot of power per se. And in terms of the parliamentary system, the current prime minister is Jonas Stor, and he's been in the leader of his party and the leader of Norway since 2021. So he leads the Labour Party, and for those of you that are not familiar with the parliamentary system, he leads a sort of a center-left coalition of different parties that govern Norway. And of course, the word Norway, if you're not familiar with that, is from the Old Norse, or the Old English, Norpweg, meaning northern way or the way north. And that phrase came into being in about 888 AD. The image here, in the center image you can see, is the red, white, and blue is actually, you'd think it's a Scandinavian thing, it's actually taken from the colors of the French flag to represent freedom and democracy. And of course the cross is reflective of Christianity that many of the Scandinavian countries incorporate into their flags. So let's talk about where Norway stands, and I think you've seen this already in terms of just casual conversation with your guides and other people and presentations, Norway is actually the most, according to a lot of different indicators and measures, the most democratic country in the world. And this is a measure, I just got it, it's from The Economist. They do their own analysis and they come up with an indicator. And they had a score, they scored Norway as 9.8 out of a scale of 0 to 10. And a full democracy is anything above 8.0. There are 4 other Nordic countries that are in the top 10 in terms of their score on this democracy index. And I won't go into the details of how it's made, but just be aware that there are 5 categories that they scored on, including the electoral process, participation in the political process, and the extent of civil liberties of the population. And once again, maybe this is just too basic, but you have to realize a number of years ago, I didn't realize this myself, but I always thought Finland was a part of Scandinavia. Finland is not a part of Scandinavia. With Sweden and Denmark, Norway makes up Scandinavian, and then Iceland is often included as part of that Scandinavian group as well. But Finland is not part of Scandinavia, largely because of the linguistic background. It's more of it's a Slavic language, and a Slavic language that has more in common with Russia than it does with the Scandinavian languages. So it's ethnically distinct from the other Scandinavian countries. If you add Finland and Iceland to this group, that's often referred to as the Nordic countries. I wanted to also place Norway in relationship to that larger, almost geopolitical group of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So Norway was a founding member of NATO in 1949, and I think we can see based on this map probably why they were a founding member, given their proximity to Russia. Historically, Norway has had this policy of, they call the phrase down the bottom here, defend and deter. So what they're saying with that phrase, it's specific to Russia. They want to express sort of a sentiment of power, but at the same time, they're still trying to maintain during their early period bilateral relationships with them. Now, of course, this was strained, this defend and deter was strained after the invasion of Crimea in 2014, and then it was strained even further, perhaps even broke after the full-scale invasion in 2022. So you now see that, and you'll see that in a later slide, that the rhetoric and the policy papers, the strategic position of Norway has changed dramatically over this last 8 years. And that's perhaps reflected in this new phrase here that's often used in their policy papers of guardian of the northern flank. And just as a reflection of that, in 2024, Norway voted to increase their defense spending, to double their defense spending. So Norway is not a member of the European Union. It does have some of the advantages of being an EU member, including being qualifying for some of the grant programs that are associated with the EU. So it does have strong ties. It is a member of the European Free Trade Association with Iceland, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. I should say that the EFTA was much larger, but over the years, countries that were part of that have joined the EU, and they no longer need to be part of this former association. And I thought this was a great. I've talked about the Schengen area as well before, but I thought this was a great slide to show you that Schengen area. And just I can go in a lot of detail on this, but for now, just be aware that you don't need a passport to move from one country in the Schengen area to another. And it explains in large part, we saw this in Iceland, and we see it here in Norway. You saw it even in Svalbard, the large number of Polish and Eastern European immigrants in Norway and Iceland and other parts of Scandinavia. I should say as well that this map is a tiny bit outdated in that those countries that are in green here that were, let's say, future Schengen partners are actually now part of the Schengen. So Croatia, Romania, and Bulgaria, they officially became part of it in 2024 and 2025. So as I say, this is a broad context of Norway. And so I thought, hey, this is a great thing. Let's look at the area of Norway in relationship to places some of us are more familiar with. So the size of Norway is about 324,000 square kilometers, and that makes it about 2/3 the size of California and about 2.5 times the size of England. But remember that it's a very different topography and climate and soil than those other two comparator places. So 50% of the exposed land in Norway is bedrock, and only 3% of the land of Norway is cultivated soil. So right away you know that that's going to have a tremendous impact upon agriculture. And in fact, there's some people actually talk about this phrase, a small population given its size. You would think it would have a much larger population, but those other places I mentioned, like California and England, they have a very strong agricultural base. So they have a very well-developed trading system, sort of a hierarchy of urban places from the smallest villages that feed into the towns, that feed into the small cities that feed. So there's a dense network of population based largely upon starting from agriculture and on. So that phrase of carrying capacity really is applicable here, in that Norway historically, with their population scattered along the coastline and the interior, did not have a very large carrying capacity. Now, carrying capacity can also be defined on the basis of services and manufacturing and many other things. But once you start with that settlement pattern that doesn't have an agriculture and central place base, it's hard to actually then develop that large, dense network of urban places. So I mentioned this in my last talk, but Norway has 84,000 kilometers of coastline, second only to Canada, and it has 40 to, I've heard various estimates, between 40 and 50,000 islands. The government policy officially is to keep islands and coastal communities connected and viable. Now, that is important because it is at odds with the most governments, regardless of what stripe of government you're in North America and in Europe, or North America and in Australia. In many of those other jurisdictions, I don't include Europe in there, they tend not to have as much attention paid to rural areas. They're much more urban focused in policy. So when you start reading about Norway, you realize that it's described as the most rural and one of the most urban countries in Europe. And I thought, well, wait a sec, how can it be the most rural and one of the most urban places at the same time? It is the 12th most urban country in Europe out of about 46 jurisdictions, where 83% of the population live in urban areas. However, in Norway, the definition of urban area is a minimum of 200 people. So it doesn't take much to count to be urban in Norway. So it's still very rural, and there's not much in between the large cities like Oslo and Bergen and even Tromsø as the gateway to the north. And all of these smaller villages, largely coastal or interior village, that had their origins from the fishing and herding for the interior. So this coastline and fjord kind of lifestyle, social lifestyle, and the mountains shaped the settlement patterns. And until the 20th century, there was actually very little overland transportation corridors or networks. So they were really connected by the sea and by ferries. And I was on one of the tours, I can't remember where it was recently, that they said, probably the other day, the tour guide said, when there's a winter blizzard, we're just cut off. The only thing that connects us is the ferry. And that daily ferry is the lifeline. And so that sort of harkens back to what life was probably like prior to the start of the 20th century. So to understand Norway's rural development, you have to understand its governance. In Norway, there's been sort of a sense of an urban-rural tension for hundreds of years, and it probably was reinforced, you can see from this image, during the time of Danish rule for that about 250-year period from about 1536 to the 1814. Oslo was the center of the Danish administration, and partly because of that, there's been an anti-urban bias until actually probably just recently. And you still find that many of the policies favor rural areas. So that's why I said that there's almost a historical element to the prevailing sort of policy in here. Norway is one of the most decentralized governments in Europe. And like Iceland, cities or municipalities have a lot of power and a lot of responsibility for delivering urban policy. So just as examples, it's the municipality that is responsible for running hospitals, childcare, kindergartens, and schools at least up to age 15, and providing the social services. And unlike the case in America and Canada and other places, it's the cities that have almost exclusive rights over or responsibility for land use planning. So it's not delegated from the regions or the states or the provinces in the equivalent of other places. So unlike even in the rest of Europe, cities have much more power than in other contexts. This image on the right, you see as of 2024, there were 15 counties and there are 356 municipalities. The municipalities have the power to levy taxes beyond just levying municipal property taxes. And regional government, that middle tier that we think of as being so strong in many other settings, developed settings, it's weaker than it is elsewhere in Europe. So the regional governments actually do have responsibility for high schools, for regional planning, and for public transit and for business development. So one of the key characteristics that I'm leading to here is that federal policy supports rural regions, and the cities and local districts have a lot of innovation and creativity to develop what they feel is most appropriate given their assets. So let's step back a little bit and talk about the early economy in Norway, and I think you can almost guess what I'm going to talk about here. Norway historically was one of the poorest countries in Europe. In fact, if you go back 150 years, 1870 or so, their gross domestic product, the value of their economy per person, was only about 3/4 of the Western European average. So historically and culturally, it's been a resource-based economy. So starting with fishing and herding, then it changed to metals and mining, to oil and fish farming and natural gas, and now there's sort of bits and pieces of all of those put together. And so are there hundreds, if not thousands, of small independent communities where the sea, as I said before, was really the highway. In the interior, you see a lot of small villages and small-scale agriculture, not the large farms, just because the landscape just doesn't support those large-scale farms. This image on the right you see is a loft building in the interior of Norway, and on the left, it's a small historic image of a small village that probably has mixed farming and livestock raising and so on. After World War II, Norway embarked on a set of social reforms, and that included reducing poverty and providing free health care and free education to the population, even to the level of college and university. So if you're a Norwegian child that wants to go to college and university, tuition is free in the country. But of course that means it's paid for by higher taxes. And that's part of in an earlier presentation I talked about this with respect to Iceland. That's part of the social contract that the government has with its population. By 1973, the GDP per capita in Norway was the same or about the same as the rest of Western Europe. But by 2001, especially with now the revenues being generated from oil and gas exports, the GDP per capita was 25% greater than the rest of Europe. So it changed from one of the poorest to now be one of the wealthiest countries, not only in Europe, but in the world. So let's talk a little bit about oil and gas in Norway, because it's got a lot to do with how they're able actually to support development. That red circle you see here is actually the very first set of oil fields that were discovered off of the coast of southwestern Norway. And this is the Ekofisk oil field in the North Sea, sort of in between Norway and Scotland. And I wanted to point out here that dashed white line. Those are the exclusive economic zones. So the responsibility and reward almost for the resources that are there are divided between the countries there. And you can see just by that, it's the UK, Scotland, and Norway. And there's not very much, at least that's been discovered so far, in Denmark or further south. Since the discovery of these early oil fields, Norway's expanded and have given licenses to other oil fields further north in the Norwegian Sea and the Barents Sea. Currently, oil and gas make up 20% of Norway's economy and 40% of their export earnings. And they're the largest employer in the country at 60,000 people. And these jobs are very highly paid, or relatively highly paid, and they're full-time jobs compared to the seasonal jobs that are often associated with fishing, and even tourism is a much more seasonal job. So they're very high paid jobs and high benefit jobs as well. I wanted to point a couple of things out on this image you see. You can see that oil production, and that's that green line, has continued to increase and peaked in about the late 1990s. And since then, it's sort of fallen off and gone down a little bit. So it's now, well, it's not there, and I've got a figure coming up. It's about 2 million barrels a day of oil. But you can see how natural gas has actually continued to increase during that period. So collectively, the total oil and gas production has been fairly stable from those early 1990 period right through to today. Natural gas actually increased tremendously over the last couple of years to Europe after the 2022 Nord Stream explosion of the pipeline. And then also with the sanctions on Russia, Norway now provides 25% of Europe's oil and gas needs. So virtually all of Norway's oil and gas production is offshore, so it's not like the Texas, and it's not like northern Alberta and places like that. It's almost all offshore. So what that means is that for rural communities, they benefit in several ways, the coastal communities especially. They benefit from jobs in the oil and gas industry itself, but they also benefit from the maintenance jobs, the construction of the platforms, the tankers, the pipelines. So you can see this image on the right is probably a platform that either in being repaired or it's ready to be towed out to sea. And what that's allowed Norway to do is establish a so-called rainy day fund. And it was called initially an oil fund, but it's now called a sovereign wealth fund. It was sometimes called a pension fund as well, but I think that's confusing to a lot of people. So they established this sovereign wealth fund in 1990, and that has allowed them, as you can see in just a moment, to do a lot of other things. So you can see more recently, they've expanded into the licenses up here on the image on the right into the Barents Sea in terms of giving licenses for drilling. And that oil and gas revenue that I mentioned, this wealth fund, is the largest wealth fund in the world at, I think it's the most recent estimates, it's about $2 trillion US. And if you looked at that, you divided that in the number of people in Norway, that's about $325,000 for every man, woman, and child in Norway. And although this sounds small, they're invested, they own about 1.5% of all the shares of all the companies, listed companies in the world. And that represents about 8,500 companies. So they view this as a almost a savings account or a rainy day fund for when either the resource runs out or to even out the booms and busts that are inevitable that happen with resource-based economies. There are some conditions on this because they were worried. There are a lot of resource-based economies that have trouble, even though they're wealthy. They have trouble in that it almost makes their other sectors wither and die because of the strength of the resource-based economy. And so they had to put in some rules. One is that they can only invest in international companies. They can't invest in Norwegian companies because they don't want that to distort the share prices and the future of those companies. And they aren't allowed to provide very much money back to the general revenues of Norway. In fact, I think they're only allowed to divert a certain amount of the percentage of interest, the interest that they've earned on the principal that goes back into general revenues. But at the same time, that still represents about 20% of Norway's government revenues. So it allows Norway to fund, even with that 20%, allows them to fund a lot of social and infrastructure programs. I'll add as well here that a lot of countries and provinces and states within countries have tried to do the same thing, but they find it very difficult to actually stick to their guns because political life is politics is a strange creature. And it's hard to have long-term political will to resist spending the principal because there's always another crisis that emerges. And so many of the jurisdictions that have created these funds find that they tap into them when the next crisis emerges, and then they draw down that principal. So I want to turn now from that oil and gas, and we'll come back to that in a little while, to immigration. There are 600 of the 5.6 million people living in Norway, about 650,000 of them are foreign born. And 200,000 of those are from Poland and Ukraine alone. Before the pandemic, Norway had a positive net international immigration, every year from the 1960s right up to the pandemic, except for 1 year in 1989. And don't ask me what happened in 1989. And this continued to increase with expansion of the EU and expansion of the Schengen area especially. So that in 2004 they averaged about 40,000 immigrants that came in, but and then from 2021, 91,000 new immigrants came in. So you can see it's created quite an impact on the population. And that was partly because of that expansion of Schengen. So what role do the immigrants play within the economy, especially the rural economy? One thing we have to realize that the immigrants are not, the newcomers are not spread evenly throughout the country. So there's a large difference by community, and it's often associated with the presence of fish processing places, and in fact where there's a large tourism presence as well. Because in addition to working in jobs in processing, like manufacturing processing, many immigrants are starting to become involved, as we've seen from some of our tour guides and the people we meet in the tourism sector. In general, there's a higher percentage of immigrants in rural communities than there is in urban places. And then think about that for a minute, because that's very unusual. In most places where you have a large in-migration, they tend to go to larger cities. And they go there because that's where the most job opportunities are, and that's where their diaspora is. That's where they can find comfort and social comfort with people who have recently immigrated from their home country. That's not the case in Norway. And part of it here, the reason is that the immigrants and refugees especially have been intentionally placed in rural areas. Now they can move out of there after a certain period of time, but there's been a conscious policy to try to relocate or encourage immigrants to go to rural places. And that's to counter the outmigration of Norwegian youth that's taking place, just as there's been outmigration of youth in rural places around the world. So it sort of counters that outmigration. So even though statistics show that that rural population has decreased in the last few decades, the population has become much more diverse than it was before. And the new immigrants have filled the labor shortages that would have existed otherwise without migration of young Norwegians. The challenges for the immigrants, as I think you'll probably imagine, is one is that challenge of integrated within a very different kind of community, a challenge of having the host community accept them as a member of their community, and adapting to unfamiliar environments, including potentially 2 months of no sunshine. In Norway, regional development, as I sort of mentioned before, is almost equivalent to rural development. In 2005, the Norwegian foreign minister, who's now the prime minister, urged people to look north, and he launched what he referred to as the High North policy. And the High North policy was based upon economic development and strengthening the relationship with Russia. So how times have changed. And I wanted to highlight a couple of this phrase here. It's really a comment on the High North policy, that you were looking at it from the lens of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Local Government and Regional Development. So they were looking at it in terms of how do we create stronger bilateral relationships, especially with Russia and especially in the High North. In fact, the president of Russia at the time, Medvedev, declared a new era in Norwegian-Russian relations. And in 2012, the residents of northeast Norway could travel visa-free across the border to northwest Russia. That's changed as well now. Now, with Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014, the mood soured, and falling oil prices meant fewer projects and fewer jobs. So the Arctic policy was a new Arctic policy released in 2020, and there's much more harsh rhetoric now about great power rivalry and power struggle on Norway's doorstep. So the political emphasis now is on a convergence of foreign and domestic priorities. In this image here, you see that government says they need to provide employment and public services to improve the quality of life so that we can get people either to stay in the north or come back and move back to the north. And one example of rural public spending, the emphasis has been on, is improving the transportation infrastructure there and keeping communities connected. And so my next two slides are going to be an example of keeping communities connected. So how do you keep communities connected, these hundreds of coastal communities, and feel like they're more than just an isolated fishing community? So this is one of the rural development's priorities. Norway has the longest road tunnel through rock at just under 25 kilometers, and the longest subsea tunnel at 24 kilometers. On the left-hand side here is this image. This is the image of the Highway E39. This is about a 1,100 kilometer road system from Klet in the north, just south of Trondheim, and extending through Bergen and Stavanger and right to the southern city of Kristiansand. And it currently takes about 21 hours to go through this distance, and there's up to 9 ferry crossings that's associated with it. What the Norwegian government is proposing is to actually connect all of these and get rid of almost all of the ferry crossings with tunnels. So you can reduce the time from about 21 hours, the travel time from 21 hours to 11 hours. Image at the right here is actually the road system going further north up into Tromsø, where we are right now. They've also improved the rail network over this period of time. And part of that is not only to connect people, so it's passenger travel, but it's also freight, and particularly salmon, the salmon that's at the aquaculture places, because this image on the left shows some of the container ships that are taking the salmon on the rail lines. And it's 40% faster to take the salmon on rail line than it is to take them by ship. And so if you're concerned about connecting for either live king crab, for example, and others, they wanted a very efficient and very effective and very fast system. So one example of rural transformation of spending is this thing called the Rogafest Tunnel Project that's under construction, that's due to be completed in 2033. It's a 27-kilometer system that runs from Randall to Balkan, and it's projected to cost just over $2 billion US when it's finished. And it's part of that larger $46 billion project that is part of that E39 system to reduce that distance, that travel time from 21 to 11 hours. But I should add as well, when you look back at that thing, this image here, that's still only the bottom 1/3 of the country. So it's trying to improve the transportation system, but it still doesn't extend all the way up into to northern Norway. So let's, in the last 15 minutes I've got, let's look now at some of these case studies. And the first one I'm going to look at is Lofoten, a place, an area, set of islands that we're going to be traveling to shortly. And I wanted to look at this largely because of I mentioned that municipalities have a lot of power and control now. And the way that they're expressing that power and control in relationship to the central government, and how they're embracing locally based change, in some cases much to the chagrin of the federal government policy. As I just showed you earlier, the federal government, the Norwegian government, wants to increase the drilling in the Norwegian Sea and the Barents Sea. However, the local people had put in place, historically, a moratorium on offshore oil petroleum production. The Norwegian government tried to appeal those local bans, and so far at least the Supreme Court has sided with the local governments. Now the federal government is appealing that decision, so we don't know what's going to happen yet, but at least in Lofoten, this is an example where the local government actually won to protect it. And what the Lofoten area is doing now is trying to embrace a culture of, they call themselves the Green Islands, where they're embracing a diverse set of economic development, including fishing, aquaculture, tourism, and hydroelectric development. The second one I just wanted to mention, just the second case study, is right here in Tromsø, or where we were just probably an hour ago. And Tromsø has a lot of nicknames, as you've already heard probably. The first is the gateway to the north, and that's probably because of that self-proclaimed capital of Norway, of northern Norway. In the 19th century, the visitors called it the Paris of the North. And I don't know how many of you went to the Polar Museum today yet, but I snapped this picture on the right here of a mannequin with an Arctic fox. That's part of the reason why it was called the Paris of the North, because it was the epitome of high fashion to wear the furs and that. So that's sort of, I think that's one of the reasons why it had that nickname. And Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson, the writer of Norway's national anthem, said Tromsø is all champagne and spectacle. You get some sense of how people approached Tromsø at the time. What I wanted to talk about is now how Tromsø is reinventing itself as well now into the future. Now it's the home of the Secretariat of the Arctic Council, where they get together. They normally would get together for cooperating on Arctic issues. And that's sort of 8 nations, Arctic nations. By the way, I'm wearing my University of the Arctic tie in recognition of this talk. There have been no in-person meetings of the Arctic Council since 2022, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I should note that Norway has actually tried to take the initiative of restarting, at least, and changing the protocols to allow decisions to be made through written procedures as opposed to in-person meetings. But mainly, as you've seen, it's a center of higher education, and they're trying to take advantage of that. It effectively is a university or college town, where 17,000 of the 40,000 people that live on at least the island of Tromsø are students when they're in session. And the federal government is trying to do this and support this, and made this one of the university towns, because they're trying to find ways to encourage population to disperse into places. So even though Tromsø is an large urban place, it can do a lot in order to encourage population further north and in the interior, and try to keep the youth here after they've graduated. The University of Tromsø, in addition to having that number of students, has many master's programs and PhD programs. They're trying to create a marine biotechnology emphasis. So with spin-off companies and investment in small-scale companies, it's too early probably to say whether they're going to be successful or not, but you can get some sense of what their emphasis is on in terms of their future development. The last one I wanted to look at here as a case study is Finnmark, and some of you were very close to here and very close to the Russian border when you went up to North Cape a couple of days ago. Finnmark, the region of Finnmark has 75,000 people in it. It's very fishing dependent, like the king crab and others, and the cod. And it borders Russia. You can see I've put a red arrow here to the Russian border, with a 190 or 200 kilometer border, or 120 mile border with Russia. And that's near that community of Kirkenes. Historically, this border and the relationship between Russia and Norway was quite important. It's part of, as Penny mentioned, it was part of the Sapmi area that was traditionally been used by the Sami. And they herd reindeer back and forth between Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. And as we've heard, and you've seen from other people, that World War II, there are very strong ties between Russia and the Norwegian partisans as they banded together to try to defeat the German forces. So a lot of traditional military history that they have in common. In addition to that, the economy, as I mentioned before, is based on king crab and the cod fishery, tourism, and they're hoping for future gas production platforms in the Barents Sea. Now, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this represented the last border crossing between the EU and Russia, and it's now closed to all but long-term visa holders. And that's led to a couple of problems. One is the security of the hydroelectricity supply, in that the area of East Finnmark actually received 25% of their hydroelectricity from a dam on the Russian side of it. And so Russia could theoretically, technically cut off that supply at any time they wanted. The second problem is that traditional right of the Sami to cross borders with herds. They still need visas to it, but as I said, I think Penny commented on this, but I know she wanted to comment more, but she didn't have time to do this. There was a 1977 agreement between Russia and Norway to allow the Sami to go across, but they did say in that agreement that if the reindeer causes any damage, Russia has to be compensated, or the other side has to be compensated for it, and also they have to be responsible for getting the herds back. Now, how do you herd reindeer back by themselves? But that agreement and the clause in it that says you have to compensate has never really been in effect. Nobody really enforced it for many years. However, just recently, the Russians have submitted a claim of $4.4 million for damage that the reindeer herds have caused to lichen in the nearby Russian parks. So Norway's future dilemma, and I hope some of you have guessed this correctly here. Have you guessed what it is? Norway's high quality of life and their wealth has been built primarily recently on oil and gas exports. You've seen this image before, and it is peaking now. It peaked at 3.7 million in oil, but it's gone down to 2, but you're still getting a lot of gas production. Norway says its fossil fuels are much cleaner than others, but there's still fossil fuels. For a country that prides itself in respect for the natural environment, they have an ethical dilemma about relying upon this as a source for their own development. And so recently, in the last year, they've released what they call the Green Industrial Initiative, and they're proposing to cut their emissions, their carbon emissions, by 50% by 2030. You can see that pink dot down there. It might be difficult to get to that. So that's the 50%, and then they're hoped to go down to at least 90% by 2050. And they're going to do this by a number of strategies, but primarily by investing a tremendous amounts of money in renewable energy projects, including offshore wind, hydrogen, heat pumps, electricity, solar where you can put it in, and for rural areas for biofuel projects. But you can imagine, based on the landscape from yesterday, there's probably not much likelihood of doing biofuel projects in the far north of Norway. So the question then is, will they be successful in this attempt to try to wean themselves off their dependence upon their wealth being generated by oil and gas? I think it's still an open question, the one that probably is in the top of mind for many different people, for many political perspectives and environmental perspectives in Norway. That's all for tonight, and I wanted to make sure I let you know that my next talk, I've only got a 24-hour turnaround, and I'll be back here at the same time on the same station at 6:30, and I'm going to give you a talk on understanding islands through literature and film, and these three things I've got as part of my slides up there. So it's going to be a diverse sort of talk about how islands are represented in films and in literature and books, and how we understand islands because of those films and books. So thank you very much, and I appreciate you coming out. I'll be at the back once again if you wanted to ask me any other questions.